Hello everybody. Welcome to the Recenter's latest lunchtime webinar series. Welcome to everyone who's joined us online. I can see we've got quite a few people now joining us. Today's presentation is from Professor Leon Feinstein, who's Director of the Recenter, Professor James Robson, Director of Scope, and Dr. Jo Begbie, who's Programme Director of the Astrophoria Foundation here. Leon is going to be presenting findings from a recently published report on pathways into and through higher education for young people with experience of children's social care. It's a piece of research that was funded by TASO, Transforming Access of Student Outcomes in Higher Education. Co-author to the report, James Robson, is then going to reflect on some of the general implications for widening participation in higher education, and then Jo Begbie is going to reflect on the approach of the Astrophoria Foundation here at Oxford and the wider university. And then we'll have some time afterwards for questions. So if you're online, if you want to put questions in the chat, and then we'll obviously get through as many as we possibly can. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Leon, for the presentation.
Thank you, Georgia. Thanks everyone for joining online, and thanks to colleagues on the panel here. We've set ourselves up as a panel. I hope you can see us okay. But the aim of this is to get into a discussion about the implications of this report and to put it in the context of wider policy on higher and further education. And delighted to have James and Jo here to discuss some of the implications. But I'm just going to quickly summarise the purpose, the methods and the findings from this study, which, as Georgia said, was funded by TASO, also by foundations, the What Works Centre, and to a degree by the Recenter, because this was a project that started, I think, 4 years ago. Pretty much tail end of COVID, with the idea of linking national data sets in order to look at the pathways into and through higher education for young people with experience of children's social care. But it took a very long time to get all the data, permissions and the access and the linking and so on. So this was a long project, and I really thank TASO particularly for their forbearance as we work through all those issues, and we finally published in March of this year. Just to give you an overview, we're looking at patterns of entry to higher education. I'll talk about what I mean by that, and I'll also talk about what we mean by young people with experience of children's social care, slightly unusual phrase. And as I said, we're looking at national administrative data, which I'll describe in a bit more detail. And we're really looking at descriptive questions in these data. We've got a population level study, over 500,000 young people in the data, and we're just looking descriptively at pathways into and through higher education. When and where do different groups of young people tend to enter? What tends to happen to them as they progress, and how does that vary with different characteristics? So the statistics are very simple, but there are lots of them, and the data are very rich. And this is really just what we've been able to do in this project so far is just the very first cut of what the data enable, and we might in the discussion get into some of the issues that need further probing. But as I said, this is really just descriptive analysis. We're not saying anything about interventions or causes particularly, although we might get into those things in the discussion. So we've used this phrase, young people with experience of children's social care, emphasising that this isn't just a study of young people who have been in care, but also those who've been on a child protection plan or a child in need. So have had contact with experience of children's social care, but have not necessarily been taken into care. And that's the main innovation of this study, that we're not just looking at care leavers, which as a group very important group in terms of social policy in this country, and care leavers in general recognised within the policy system of widening participation on the radar of universities as a group that may require additional support and are eligible for various forms of support from universities, together with estranged students. But what this study is about is not just that group, but also a wider set of groups of young people who have had experience of children's social care. And this has been a theme of research at the Rees Centre in its history, thinking particularly about work Nicky Luke, Dave Berridge, and Julie Sever and others did, looking at the educational outcomes of children in need, and finding that in some respects their educational outcomes on average may be worse than those who have been in care. And that was a big theme of research that led to some changes in policy, broadening of the virtual school head role and so on. And so this is a theme I think that's quite important, that there are other groups of young people than care leavers or those ever in care who may benefit from additional support, and whose contribution is not fully recognised, and whose potential is not fully recognised or achieved within the education system currently. That's the hypothesis that we are looking at in this study. We compare outcomes for those groups, average outcomes for those groups, to the group comprised of young people eligible for free school meals at any point in the 6 years before they completed Key Stage 4. So the FSM group, a staple of inequality study in this country, and the basis of the pupil premium. So an important comparison group of young people in families with relatively low income, very large group, and then also comparing outcomes from the groups with experience of children's social care to the general population, that is to say, those who are not in any of the other 6 groups. And essentially, we're just looking at average statistics for those 7 groups and comparing them. I'll talk more about the data and some of the challenges of this. And the main variable I'm going to talk about today is entry to higher education by age 22. Talk about entry to higher education as in a level 4 qualification. So registering for a course at a level 4 level at a higher education institute or at an FE college. So broad, but based on the national definition of HE, but a broad definition that is more than just starting a degree at a university. And that's our primary outcome, is entry to HE. Age 22 is a cutoff in our data. I'll talk more about the data. That's just the limitations of time. But it's an important limitation on the study. Many people go into higher education after age 22, and that may be particularly important for young people who have disengaged from education early, that they may come back to it later. That is a theme we know for care leavers. So that's a limitation of the study. We have looked at other outcomes that I'm not going to talk about today. Age 18, 19 entry as the classic mainstream route in this country. We also look at the type of institution attended, the qualification pursued, whether the degree is paused or completed or not, and a range of other outcomes actually. But that's the broad pattern of results is the same across all of those outcomes. So I'm mainly just going to talk about entry to HE by age 22 today. In terms of the data, we've got 5 data sets. I should particularly thank here Mark Wigley, who did the linking in the SRS of the ONS across these 5 data sets. So we've got the children looked after data return and the child in need census. So we've got certain information to identify our care experience groups and our groups with experience of children's social care. We also have the National Pupil Database, all of which have been linked to the individualised learner record, which gives data on post-16 participation, and the higher education student statistics, which give data on higher education participation. And across those 5 data sets, we can essentially construct what we've done is construct a year of births. So we've taken the school year 98-99. So any young person in those data sets born in the school year 98-99 is in our study of 556,000 young people. So we've got population level data. There are exclusions. We don't have in the National Pupil Database children in private schools. So 7-8% of the population excluded from this study, and that would change the results substantially, the comparisons. And there are other subgroups that may be missing from the data, but broadly, this is population level, and you know, obviously a very, very large study. That gives it a certain representativeness, but at the same time, this was a cohort who experienced COVID that might change the results in certain ways, and results might look different for other cohorts. But we think this is gives a strong indication of the general trend within England as of now. So in our sample of 556,240 young people, 16% of that sample had some experience of children's social care, in terms of the definitions I gave earlier. And you can see on the figure on the right that care leavers are only 5% of that 16%. So studies before now, which have been able to look at care leavers, you can see are picking up a small proportion of this wider notion of young people with experience of children's social care, half of the 16% had experience as a child in need for less than 6 months. So a relatively low level of stay in experience of children's social care. 30% had experience for more than 6 months as a child in need. We also have those ever on a child protection plan and those ever in care, both groups larger than the care leavers group. So we're looking at a broader range here. And there are important and subtle issues in the definitions there that we don't have time to discuss. But essentially, we make the assumption that young people are in one of those groups. You can't be in more than one of those groups in the study, although in practice, of course, you can. So we've taken out of the analysis children with a disability, but children with SEN are included in the broad population. 17% in the wider sample had a special educational need. You can see some other descriptive data there. In general, by age 22, 48% of the total sample had entered higher education, 60% of whom had completed a degree, 8% had withdrawn, and 25% were still studying. So you can see the censoring of the data by age 22. We don't have the final outcome for 25% of those who had entered higher education. So that's the sample. I'm not going to say a lot about methods, except to say essentially this is, as I said earlier, descriptive data. And I think it's important to emphasize in looking at averages for large groups across a population, we're essentially describing society rather than individuals. In looking at averages, we're getting a sense of the aggregate picture. This doesn't say anything about the aspirations, the intentions, the requirements, needs, and experiences of individuals, and it doesn't capture the variety and the complexity of individual lives. This is very much a study that tells us about general patterns within society as a whole, and I think it says more about institutions and the education system than it does about individuals. And that distinction, I think, is important when looking at averages. We're not looking at individual experience, we're looking at aggregates. And essentially, the models here are bivariate descriptives. We're just looking at averages, we're looking at correlations, we're looking at three-way and four-way cross-tabulations to look to a degree into some of the really important intersectionality that exists within the data. And we do some regression analysis, which I'll describe the results for, which is just seeing if you try and take account of background characteristics in a statistical linear regression, is there any remaining association of experience of children's social care with outcomes for those that are particularly concerned about the conditional results. We have done that. A couple of other points on methods. Important to say we don't know the dates of everything that happens to these young people. So just by virtue of the structure of the data, what we're able to establish is 6 waves of points of measurement, wave 1 being school experience, but focusing here on the slide here at the end of what we've called wave 2, we know from the National Pupil Database qualifications achieved at the end of Key Stage 4, and then we know from the individualized learner record what young people have registered for in their next entry into education. We don't necessarily know the date at which that happened. And then we know when they complete FE, what they have achieved. We don't know everything that happens in between those two things. So they're really important parts of the journey that we're not looking at there. We then know if they register for a higher education study, which we're calling that point wave 5, what they've registered for. We don't necessarily know exactly when that is. That's important. And then we know what qualifications they've achieved, either at the end of higher education or by age 22, if that's what happens first. So there's a lot of important pathway analysis that we're not able to do because we don't observe dates. But we've broadly got these waves, and we can see the patterns of movement across these across this structure. So results, having given all that background, in general, rates of entry to higher education by age 22 for those with experience of children's social care are lower than for the general population, very substantially lower. That's not new for care leavers. We've already known that 14% as an initial rate of entry compares to the average in the population of 48% of those groups entering higher education by age 22, so the entry rate as an aggregate measure. But for those ever in care, it's the same. For those ever on a child protection plan, it's not statistically significantly different. For children in need for the more extended period of more than 6 months, it's very slightly different, but still very, very low. Even for those on a child in need plan for less than 6 months, the average rate of entry to higher education by age 22 is substantially lower even than the FSM population, which is the benchmark for a lot of inequality and widening participation study, I think, in England. So here, and that child in need group, less than 6 months, is 50% of our group of disadvantaged young people here. I should say there are important other subgroups of the population that are experiencing disadvantage who do not have contact with children's social care. So this is not all of those that universities ought to be mindful of and the education system ought to be mindful of, but it's broader than just the care leaver group. And you can see that across these groups, rates of entry to higher education by age 22 are low. And that's the headline finding here. And there's patterns that one can look at in terms of different outcomes, different subgroups and so on. And it does get very interesting looking into different subgroups, but there isn't time to go into that today. I'll just show a couple of those findings. This is the regression analysis. So for those who like their multivariate statistics, essentially 4 models represented in this chart with the 5% confidence interval around the estimate. And the asterisk you can see above each of those bars is saying what is statistically significant. So if we take, for example, let's take care leavers. Model 1 is just the raw difference, and you can see the odds ratio there, about just under 0.3 relative to, this is relative to the FSM population. Still, even conditioning for prior attainment in Model 3 or the location of post-16 study, as well as with Model 2, controlling for ethnicity, SEND status, socioeconomic circumstances, exclusions and absences. Model 3, prior attainment, that's attainment at age 16. Even conditioning for that, those in the care leaver group are less likely to be entering higher education by age 22 than those eligible for free school meals. The statistical significance I wouldn't want to overstate because it's population level data, so everything is statistically significant. It's a huge sample, but still you can see the coefficients there are still non-trivial. And I find that remarkable given controlling for post-16 attainment, which captures so much prior educational experience, and it just makes the point that these are groups who, on average, are very disengaged from the education system by the time they get to age 16 and even and age 18. And we see that in the age 16 outcomes, but also, even given that, they are less likely to want to follow a traditional route and stay in education or go into higher education. Some subgroups here, I mentioned that we've taken out from the study of children with disabilities, important subgroup to look at, but not the focus here. For those with special educational needs, this is just the description within each of the groups of the proportion that had SEN and identified special educational needs. So you can see care leavers, 28% had a special educational need with an EHC plan or a statement, as was the provision for this cohort, and 29% had SEN support without a statement. So more than half of that group had a special educational need. That's obviously an important part of what's going on here. And for all of our 5 groups with experience of children's social care, those proportions are higher even than for the FSM population. So that's part of what's happening. But when we look at the results differently for those different subgroups, so again, looking at the care leavers group here, so the grey bar, the 22%, is the proportion that entered higher education amongst care leavers without SEN status. 22% had entered higher education by age 22. That goes down to 4% for those with a statement. You can see the other figures there. And broadly, that pattern is the same in all of these subgroups as it is in the general population. So for the average person in the data, those with a statement less likely to enter higher education. But you can see the difference there between 22% of those with a statement in the general population. That is to say, those not in any of our 6 groups. Of those with a statement in the general population, 22% have entered higher education by 22, compared to 4% amongst care leavers or 4% amongst those subject to a CPP. So descriptives, and I can't say anything about causes. There are a lot of variabilities within those averages still, important different subgroups and variation in type of SEN and so on. But broadly, the pattern is the same within each of these groups as it is within the wider population or within free school meals. Rates of entry vary by sex. The pattern again is the same in our subgroups as it is in the general population. That is to say, males less likely to enter higher education by age 22. So for care leavers, again, the rate of entry for males, male care leavers is 10% compared to 19% for females. So we get to very low rates when we start to get into important subgroups. This is prior attainment, which is interesting as well. So looking at a Key Stage 4 achievement, you can see here that amongst care leavers or any of our groups, the light blue bar there is for those who achieve low or no grades at Key Stage 4. Amongst the general population, 28%, so excluding these groups, 28% of young people without good achievement at Key Stage 4 or with low achievement at Key Stage 4 were still entering higher education by age 22. So a lot of second chances still happening, and that's not there for our subgroups in the same way. Although there are those who do. For those who didn't achieve 5A to C, including English and Maths, so the 5 GCSEs in the yellow bar, rates of entry obviously lower than for those with higher achievement, but there were those who did enter. And this theme of second chances, I think, is a really important theme. I need to close, but I'm just going to give you one more set of statistics and then conclude. And this is about second chances. So this slide is about how people got into HE, what route did they take? And so each of those bars, you've got a bar for each of our 7 groups and then the total population. And that's everybody's included who entered HE by age 22. So we're looking of those who went into HE by 22, what was the route that they took to get there? So we're focusing it particularly on the traditional pathway compared to other pathways, where the traditional pathway is good achievement at age 16, going on to A levels, good achievement at A levels, and going straight to university or with a year's break. That's what our system is set up to do. And if you look at the general population, the group 7 there, 58%, so nearly 3/5, went through the traditional pathway. On average, it's 54% in the total population. 54% went through the traditional route. For care leavers, for children in need, for children ever on a child protection plan, that proportion is much lower. And what you see a lot more of is the yellow bar, which is young people getting into a higher education course, ending up on a level 4 course, coming through vocational pathways. And important to say, that may not be what they intended to do, but amongst care leavers, 36% who went into higher education by age 22, 36% went through a vocational route, compared to only 16% on average. So for these groups, and actually for the free school meals group as well, there is a higher than average proportion who are getting there through vocational courses, work-based courses out of school, offering them a different sort of experience, and that proving to be positive in terms of them then finding a way into higher education for those that wanted to do that, or were incentivized to do that. So just to conclude, important differences between the groups, but on average lower rates of entry than other disadvantaged groups, not fully explained by observable other characteristics. As I've emphasised, vocational qualifications seem to offer a good alternative route for many with experience with children's social care and others. And I just to conclude and say that this is not new. It's not new to find that many children and young people who have interacted with children's social care services are also very disengaged from education. It's got worse in many ways since COVID, general issues around disengagement from education, but this is a long-standing finding. It is new to show that this is also broadly true for these wider groups, and it's always helpful to see scale. We're sat here in the Education Department in Oxford. I'm delighted now to hear thoughts and comments on this from colleagues who have thought much more than I have about this policy challenge, or as Jo is actively addressing practically today, this policy challenge. Trying to emphasise in terms of the Oxford debate, this is not about reducing academic standards. This is about recognising potential and the impact of earlier experience on achievement, and being mindful of that in the way we design our education systems. We're a country with a national productivity crisis. We can't afford to allow so many people to slip through what ought to be opportunities and provision. But just to emphasise finally, a big effect on HE entry would be achieved by an enhanced FE offer, is my conclusion here. But let me hand back to Georgia to introduce our speakers next.
Yes, so next we've got Professor James Robson, Director of Scope, as I mentioned, who's going to spend a few minutes just reflecting on some of the wider policy issues and implications from today. So I'll hand over to James.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, as you said, I'm going to think about the sort of broader policy implications of this report, and I think to do that, it's worth just stepping back a little bit and saying a bit more about the current sort of policy landscape around FE and HE, because this is a moment of, I think, change. There's a lot going on as we await the spending review tomorrow. We await the likely post-16 education and training strategy due out before the summer recess. No doubt it will respond to whatever we see in the spending review. So there's lots to play for and lots going on, lots to discuss in the broader policy space. The first thing to say, I think, is that higher education and further education are fundamentally positioned by the new government as owning, to a certain extent at least, the growth mission. And that speaks to issues around productivity, skills, and broader discussions around human capital, but also the opportunity mission and issues around social mobility. And I think probably what we see in this country, which is a very static levels of social mobility. I think this report perhaps points to some of that. Critically, higher education is highlighted again and again as being in a very constrained financial situation. And that shapes the nature of the policy discussions available at the national level and at institutional level. But as I think this report highlights, FE is absolutely critical to this conversation, and under any measure applied to higher education, further education has been just as, if not more, financially constrained for a greater period of time. So the whole of the post-16 space is really undergoing major financial issues that I think inevitably lead into perhaps a drawing away of conversations around fairness and justice, given those constraints. There are also a whole range of sort of policy issues related to global discourses, geopolitics, migration, everything that's going on in the US. All of this is feeding into, I think, what we're going to see in terms of the white paper. And probably what we're going to get is a policy flavour, an ambition articulated rather than anything detailed and operationalisable. So what this really means is I think that there's a very interesting policy window at the moment to bring in findings from studies like this to feed into what might happen at the more local level around issues of widening participation. Now, given all of that, I think it's really important to emphasise a couple of key things that this report brought out. And the first one is in relation to the opportunity mission. And as far as I can see, the data highlights that there are major issues for young people experienced in children's social care related to access, particularly in terms of prestigious institutions like this one, in terms of dropout rates. And so the experience there, which obviously this report hasn't gone into because it's looking at aggregate level data, there's clearly something really profound going on around those dropout rates. I think that has significant implications for the labour market transitions. And again, I think this report highlights the need for more research to look at the labour market outcomes of these kinds of young people, but also postgraduate taught and postgraduate research access as well. There's a clear, I mean, other research has pointed out just how profound the inequalities at that point in young people's trajectories can be. And I think there's probably an implication through some of this data that that's going to be more profound for this particular group of young people. So that points to a need for more research, but a need for a deeper policy conversation about this opportunity mission and what's going on there, how we're potentially failing this group of young people. I think the policy implications around that opportunity mission highlighted here relate to the national level, the sort of national policy approaches and the institutional policy approaches. So the national level, I think there's clearly a need for a discussion with OFS around the kinds of policy frameworks that will support these sorts of young people, both in terms of initial access and in terms of broader support structures while they're on course. There's issues around regulation, where the access and participation plans are really drilling into this in enough detail. And clearly, I think they're not. So what role does the OFS have in actually regulating at this fine-grained level, digging deeper into the data that they have and that universities present to ensure that there's proper accountability and that those support structures are in place? And similarly, I think there's regulatory mechanisms around outcomes and PG access that really need to be part of this broader conversation. I appreciate that that perhaps isn't brought out quite so overtly in the report, but I think it points to it really nicely that and highlights the need for these sort of broader policy conversations. At the institutional level, I think there's a whole range of issues here that higher education institutions need to be aware of and start to reflect on in terms of their admissions policies. And I think the report highlights really nicely how the potential for reflecting on a diverse range of pathways into higher education is really important. Now, Jo, you'll say more, I'm sure, about Oxford, but I've been in education committee meetings where I've highlighted the need for even data on FE within this institution, how many people are coming through vocational pathways. We don't even collect it, let alone sort of feature it in our conversation. But I think that goes for broadly all of the Russell Group. There needs to be a much greater acknowledgement around the importance of vocational pathways and just acknowledging the messy realities of a whole range of young people coming through different sorts of pathways, although still with, I think, aspirations for higher education. And that means that there needs to probably be different kinds of admissions tools being used to actually think through potential of these young people to thrive and flourish in institutions. But the data suggests that even when in, they're not thriving and flourishing. And clearly we need more research, but I think that there are also support structures required at the institutional level that I think there clearly needs to be more reflection and work done on that. The final thing that I really want to highlight in relation to this report is, I think, the critical finding around FE. This work really highlights just how further education, vocational pathways are critical enabler for young people to progress into higher education when coming from care experience backgrounds. This points to, I think, a broader range of structural issues around the system that we have at the moment, the relationship between further and higher education. Now, I've written a lot about how problematic a market-based approach we currently have is, and the way in which competition inevitably pitches universities against each other, but also universities against further education. That's really damaging to the post-16 sector. But I think it's quite problematic for young people attempting to navigate that post-16 space. What this points to, I think, is the way in which actually further education and higher education can complement each other in a really positive way, and where where close relationships can be fostered between those, there's real potential for young people to have a much smoother transition from complex education training journeys through further education, potentially as a second chance for many people, into higher education. That's a profound and powerful story to tell. And it points, I think, to what I hope we're going to see in the white paper, which is a move towards a more integrated tertiary system where we shift from competition within the sector to collaboration between institutions, hopefully between FE and HE as key sectors here. I think that's a story that this report can tell really nicely and feed into conversations. And part of that, I think, relates to a need for institutions, particularly ones like this one, but broadly research-intensive institutions often tend to have too much of a global orientation and forget about the place-based nature of their work. If you take a place-based lens, then you start to think about the relationship between the institution, the community, and the further education college, and think about supporting these sorts of pathways that I think have been highlighted really nicely in this report. Golly, thank you.
Thank you very much for this. That's really interesting reflections there.
That's right.
You're in charge of tech today, Leon.
That's worrying for everybody.
So next, really pleased to have Dr. Jo Begbie, who's Director of the Astrophoria Foundation here, and is going to reflect on that role and that approach, but also from the wider university perspective as well.
Yes, so thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this in this context, because I think it is very fitting, and I'm going to try and pull in where it fits, where I can. So I do want to highlight that the Astrophoria Foundation year is only one of a number of initiatives that are happening across Oxford and Oxford as a collegiate university. So there are things that are happening in colleges as well as within the university more broadly. And I have also taken care to say here that it is about both widening access and success on course for underrepresented student groups, because I think that for a long time the push was for widening access without really thinking about what it meant for those students who came into courses and really thinking about whether or not they were succeeding on course. And I think that was something that is pulled out nicely in your paper about, certainly for your particular group of students. So when we were thinking about establishing a foundation year, I think it was really thinking about how to widen the opportunity for people from different types of backgrounds to come to Oxford. And so thinking about what it would be that we had to do to enable students to do that. I'm very much thinking about then who was it that the foundation year was for. And so my middle line on this says that it is for UK state non-selective school students with significant academic potential who have experienced severe personal disadvantage or disrupted education. And that is a fairly broad catch-all, but really then the sort of word cloud diagram talks about the eligibility characteristics of our very first application call. I should say we're on our second year of this running. So this was last year's students. And you can see that free school meals is probably one of our more prominent characteristics, but care experiences is right up there. We do also try and look within that and think about what it means for a young person to be care experienced and think about child in need, having had a child protection plan and that kind of thing. So trying to not just use one definition. And so one thing that the report pointed out was that prior attainment is a thing, and particularly for care experienced students, but actually, you know, the free school meals, you had it nice there as a comparator, and you can see that they were doing better than the, their sort of key stage 4 outcomes were better than care experienced young people, but they're still lower than the general population. And so we felt that for Oxford, a really important barrier to entry was the very high grades that we were asking for. And so we felt that by reducing and providing a contextualised entry grade requirement would be a way of encouraging more, or giving more young people the opportunity to access Oxford. But then it was also really important for us that that came alongside a combination of academic teaching and academic and personal support, so that then to try and have this kind of continued success and support throughout their university journey, so that they weren't falling out. So I think that, again, so those were the key bits that I picked up from the report, was that prior attainment thing, but also then really looking at the continuity once they were within higher education, and as you know, also then looking at withdrawals, but even who is still studying. And as you said, there wasn't an entry point. So how many people are going out and coming back, having these kind of in and out aspects of education. So I think there is a lot to unpick, and certainly as I look at the pool of foundation year students progressing through the university, we'll be really interested to look at all of that and see, what is their trajectory like? Are we putting support in the right places? And also, what is their outcome and their career kind of trajectory going? Have we actually given the value added that we would hope going to a university like Oxford does give them? So to try and measure that. I think really then we did do a lot of thinking about what does a student need to thrive at university, because we really wanted to have these principles that drove the design for the programme, not just to think about, well, let's lower the bar, get them in, and then, let's see how they do. And so we put it into this very basic Venn diagram of skills, and actually I've become more and more of a convert about the fact that we are teaching skills at university, even those people who say that they're classicists teaching a degree, they're teaching skills. And so I was thinking about, well, what skills are we helping students to develop? And we've kind of split it into general academic skills and subject knowledge and skills, just to try and think about, well, what do the real subject experts need to teach, and what can we provide support for that doesn't have to have such a very specialist set of skills, and also then just help students understand what it is they're learning by dissecting that a little bit. I've got wellbeing and financial support. Essentially, I think when I move on to my next slide, that comes as sort of personal development, because we've got a bit of wrapped into all of that is about thinking about what personal support students need. And then something which is now really, I think, come into focus as something that's really key and important for students is belonging. And I think certainly, so I was working at LMH beforehand, and we had this idea of something that was like belonging, but we didn't really know what it was. Whereas now that I think a lot of the research is crystallised around that, I feel content that I can say that that is one of these other pillars, if you like, or circles my Venn diagram in terms of them needing to develop this feeling of belonging, or having the right to be where they are. So those were our underlying values, principles, if you like, and then we set about trying to build something that would provide holistic support. And I'm going to show a very detailed set of boxes. It's less really about reading all of the information, it's just that it's there, but we start pre-arrival and pre-application, because essentially, I mean, we aren't going to what Leon talked about in terms of we're not necessarily going to help get over that disengagement. And if students are not yet aiming for HE, I don't think I can say that we can do that. It's about trying to get in at school and saying, well, if you would like to, here's something that might be available. So it's about trying to go in. And I guess another column which I haven't got on here is about building community, which is something that James touched on. And I suppose part of our hope is that by going into schools and actually talking to students, that we can build that kind of community feeling of, oh, actually, this is not a totally alien idea, and have that kind of ripple effect out. So, that's something that we hope to build in there. I mentioned the contextualised admissions, so to be able to offer the lower grades, we can do that. We ask additional information from the students. It is all very directly related to how we can then look at their application. So it would be around, well, if you have been in care, how long were you in care? What kind of care was it? Kinship support, was it state? So it's really kind of trying to get some of that nitty-gritty detail so that we can differentiate within it. And then I think one of the most important things for the care experience students is this fact that we do when we get an application from a care experience student, our welfare lead will get in touch with any care experience students and just say, can I help with anything around your application process? And in fact, you know, she's there as someone who they can contact ahead of time should they want any support. So for me, that's an important part for the care experience students. And then really it is about building. So in my columns, going down with my coloured columns, we've got admissions is the pink one which you saw in the last one. We've got academic, which is my general academic skills support. We're trying to build subject knowledge and subject skills. We're trying to build belonging, and we're trying to build that kind of working on that personal development. So that might be around confidence, about communication skills, could be about managing finance, etc. And you can see that we work quite intensively with our students in the first, well, they come a week before any other students, and we work with them around that. So it's not academic work, but it tends to be thinking in terms of what does it broadly mean to be at university. Let's think about critical thinking in a slightly more hand-wavy way, but also then really thinking about budgeting is a big one. Actually, it's about team building. So again, thinking about the community. It's about taking them in. I mean, we are in Oxford, so it's about actually physically taking them into some of what might look like slightly scary libraries, and making sure that they feel that they have the right to be in some of these spaces. And then this continued essentially, you can see, so then after our orientation week, we then begin to work with them less. They are then more integrated into their colleges, but we do keep in contact with them should they need it over that week. And then we start bringing in more of the academic skills in an academic induction week. And then we move into term time. So the foundation year mirrors an Oxford year. So they are based in colleges, they are taught in colleges or in the university, and they are in college at the same time as the other students. So they're having term time in the same way as everything else. I've got a gold yellow in this subject specific tuition. So there's a lot of subject teaching that will go on, but we also have all of the rest of this sort of, I'm still calling that holistic support of just trying to make sure that we are putting in place scaffolding around the students, and then actually trying to make sure that they've then built the tools using that scaffolding, and that we've told them how to use the tools and hopefully empower them to be able to then take those tools and work going forward into the university. So this kind of idea of always thinking about the academic skills, the subject skills, the belonging and the personal development is kind of going throughout. It just will be slightly different coloured depending on where it's coming from. And then really to go back to the Venn diagram of, it's, you know, again, I said we're trying to provide this holistic support, and I think that I then need to turn it into 3 dimensions. And so the only way I can think of doing that is by making it a stool, because actually every student is going to come with slightly different needs in those different legs, if you think about it. So, you know, everyone might need some degree of support and belonging, but some might need more than others. And so it's trying to work out across the course of the year how we can give the different students the different level of support so that they have this kind of slightly more secure stool to sit on when they then go into their undergraduate. I think that was really, so I mean, this is built around a huge amount of all the research that is out there. Folks sort of carried on in departments of education everywhere, thinking about what works, how to improve access, but also really thinking about the pedagogical methods and really the teaching and learning strategies that will work for different groups of students. And I think just to circle back around to something that James was saying about the vocational and the FE courses, I mean, one of the things that has been very clear to me on the foundation year is that we have people who are coming in with BTECs, and, you know, then they are going into year 1 and thriving. And I think there are occasions of that in the university, but we are then seeing that and just thinking about some of those other routes in. And the other little note that I made to myself around that was, I mean, one of the things that's really clear for us is that a lot of times those weren't choices made by the student. They've just kind of been, oh, well, you'll do the BTEC. You'll do the BTEC route, won't you? And so then thinking about, well, how can we then say, well, okay, but let's now try and give you some of the academic skills that you might have gained if you were doing not the BTEC route. The BTEC seems to be fine, but again, you know, really think about what are those academic skills that we require as a first year undergraduate, and can we provide them in any way and give them that support? So that gives us a foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got some time for some questions. I know that Luke had put a question in the chat. I think if we can minimise those, hopefully people can see us on screen. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Probably need to stop sharing. Do we need to stop sharing? I think even there, if you press the cross on the share thing, down and next to the yellow button. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we're
Yeah.
I think that makes us bigger.
So yes, thank you, all of you, for those presentations. They were really fascinating. I think we've started. We've got a question from Nikki, and then I can see Elena has got her hand up, so we'll come to you, Elena. So Nikki's question was going back to the SEN point. So subgroup analysis on SEN seems to show disproportionate disadvantage for young people with SEN who also have social care experience. So, for instance, the difference between care leavers entering HE and the general population entering HE is bigger for those with SEN than those without. Is this about more serious SEN in those social care groups, or is there something about provision of both?
It's a good question, but I'm not, we can't answer that,
No.
what we've been able to do, but that's, I mean, I did want to say something about what we will do next, because the report was published by TASO, and a number of organisations have suggested that the data would be really helpful for local authorities and universities and others to understand what's happening for their young people. And there's a lot further analysis that needs to be done of different subgroups and intersectionality. So DFE have already agreed to archive the data so that we can do more analysis of it, but we're trying to explore a funding model for that, and also exploring how to build into the analysis some kind of local authority or area identification, which we can't do, but maybe the higher education sector can do. And so there's work to try to develop that function and where it would sit between ONS and DFE and others. So I think it's a long answer, but in brief, in relation to Nikki's question, we can get into that a little bit in the data. We know a little bit about the type of special educational need, and there are a lot of other covariates there in relation to children in need and their durations of care and so on. So there's a lot more analysis that might be done, but we can't answer it yet.
Fair enough.
I'm just going to put that in there. So one of the things that we have really identified is how much undiagnosed, certainly SPLDs, etc., coming through with our foundation year groups. And so again, I wonder, I mean, that might be a confounding factor as well, because I think I just think that it might not be seen until later, because I mean, some people who don't go for testing, etc., etc. So I think it'd be an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to say, I think moving forward, measures around EHCPs are really complicated because they're so hard to get. There's a real crisis going on. So obviously this is slightly older data, and perhaps some of the HCPs are easier to spot. But I think we've got a whole new cohort coming through with people who have just enormously struggled to get EHCPs, and that's related to socioeconomic status. So the data is going to get really, really muddy, very, very quickly.
Yeah, and presumably because it's now COVID, such an age teenagers coming through, there are a lot of other issues that will, have come out at that point.
So I think I didn't slip to my 20 minutes because that's close to the not long for discussion.
we've got 15 minutes, so
Oh.
that's fine. We're here to quarter to. We've got Elena, you've got your hand up.
Hello, sorry, hiya. My colleague and I are just in a bit of a cupboard office situation, so we're going to be off camera if that's okay. But hopefully you can hear us. Actually, our question was about the foundation year, and we're just wondering. Well, the first part is really, could you remind us what the intakes were for the first and second cohort?
Yeah.
And then could you tell us a little bit about how they're actually doing, especially the ones who will have done prelims by now? Yeah, do you have any data on that? Would be quite useful.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't actually done prelims yet, and so I'm waiting on tenterhooks for that bit of information, and we will share it when we do. So it is small. So our very first cohort was 22 students, and then this year has been 28 students. We have funding to get up to 50 students, and so, you know, we should see we need to keep growing. Of the 22 students, we had 86% who returned to Oxford University, so that was 19 of them. And others, we had someone who withdrew during the course, and others who haven't yet gone elsewhere, but they've applied to go elsewhere out of that very first cohort. And as I say, we are awaiting prelims results to see how they're doing. I think that a piece of work going forward will be to work with the university just to embed some of the support more broadly, because I think it is support that will be required by many students. I think that I came into running the foundation year through having been medicine tutor, and so a lot of this was thinking about, well, what would have some of my first year intake really needed to help them thrive. And so again, you know, there's that's built into it, and we can then think about how that's worked, but we don't know yet what it means for these students.
And how have they found the foundation year itself, given, you know, all of this support? They must have, you know, sorry, have you surveyed them, I suppose?
We have surveyed them. So we are carrying out a sort of a longitudinal survey that began proper with the second cohort. So we didn't do so much with the first cohort just because we're trying to get things off the ground. So we will have a better picture for the second cohort, where we are surveying them every term to see how they feel their academic skills are developing, their belonging, etc. So we're using certainly using some of the TASO survey things around belonging and academic efficacy to look and think about how that is progressing for the students, how they find it, and then we will look at them again in year one and again at the end of the degree, because I think my experience from running the LMH one was that how they see their academic skills are changing depends on where they are, if that makes sense. So in the first term, they may think that they're feeling much more confident and that they are ready for anything, and then suddenly in term two they say, oh, actually I need to work on X, Y, Z. So again, it's developing. I don't need to be. We will share everything when we have it. Just at the moment, because we're still quite young, we don't have that yet.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. We're just interested, obviously. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Elena. We've got a question. This is probably initially for you again, Jo, from Hannah Hudson, saying what kind of things does the University of Oxford do to support belonging? It's fascinating, this concept of belonging. It is very much focused on.
It is. I think that again, I'll go back to academic design, etc., and thinking about things like the hidden curriculum. So trying to unpick some of that a little bit, because again, I think one of the things that you start realising when you work with the foundation year students are just how many assumptions we make, and so part of it is around that, trying to help that transition and that recognition that actually the language of HE is not really the language that is used out on the streets every day. So some of that is around that. That's a very broad sense of belonging, but it's about trying to then think about, well, how is a university experience different to what you might experience elsewhere, and thinking about, well, how can we address some of those head on? And so actually sometimes it is, well, you might think this is strange, but this. And so we do, I mean, we have a strand that runs through which we call society and culture, in part thinking about social capital and cultural capital, and that there is not one that's wrong and there's not one that's right, but that these things exist, and what might it mean, and how might that be different in one place compared to another place. And so partly it's just trying to kind of lift the rug a little bit and see what's there, and just saying, well, actually, if you, yeah, so that, and I know that's a very broad sense of belonging. Some of it is literally, as I said, about going in with the students into a library and saying, come on, you can, you know, you absolutely have the right to be here. So again, basing it off the experiences that I may have had coming here as a 30-odd-year-old and feeling like I didn't have the right to move into a library. So it's all kinds of little things, actually.
And how much is because some people obviously have huge sense of belonging in Oxford and entitlement and all the rest of it. So how much is the difficulty of experience of belonging, the fact that others have such a strong sense of identity and comfort in the environment?
I think with the foundation year students, and again, you know, our more longitudinal survey would be really interesting to pick some of this apart, but I think, again, speaking for the foundation year, and I'm speaking on my behalf, not on the student behalf, but I think they appreciate it being put out there in the open to discuss. And so to be able to say, well, there might be some people for whom this feels normal, but there might, you know, with that is a spectrum in its own right. And so it is about trying to say, well, you know, just think about that. And, you know, so, and I suppose part of trying to encourage the students to be academically curious in terms of what makes you a good academic is then thinking about, well, can you take this to somewhere else, you know? Can you be curious about what happens elsewhere, you know, in your interactions in the university and the college, and just starting to think, oh, actually, and even asking them what assumptions do they make? You know, have they assumed that someone's rich and whatever, and that maybe if they stop assuming that and just have a conversation, that it will be okay. And actually, some of our students who have talked about it have said that that is something that they found is when they actually just go in with an open mind, they've been pleasantly surprised. We've got another belonging related question. Struck a chord with people, but yes, we got. It is. I mean, I think that. Have we got time? So, I mean, I think belonging. I mean, but as I say, belonging is what for me was my big discovery at MH was just like, oh right, actually, this is what we've got to do. And actually, if you do some of this work around. Feeling like you have a right to be at university in HE, then that helps the confidence. So I think part of what the students need is a bit of personal confidence to help them have the academic confidence to then go, okay, now I know what I'm doing. So I think that is why that belonging thing has become important. And I think that sorry, I'm quickly reading on how does the data look on supporting belonging? I mean, so one of the things about that question around schools and students. So one thing, and again, I'm going to use my LMH experience, is one thing that we saw there, because we ran a pilot programme for 8 years. And one thing that we saw was that we might have a student who came to the foundation year, 1 year, and then a few years later, someone would apply from that same school for the direct route. And so that felt a little bit like, because we've gone in and we'd said, okay, you know, this is Oxford, this is what it is. And we talked about it, and then someone from their community was now at Oxford. It had normalised it a bit. And so having that buy-in from that school or just the school going, oh, yeah, we could send some more there. So again, the data is little because we are talking very small numbers, but I think it's something that we are keeping, we are gathering as much data as possible to try and work out where we have any of these impacts.
Some fascinating data coming out of the Astrophoria.
I think the problem I'm going to caveat is that it is really little, so the data is going to be so small that it is going to be slightly anecdotal still for a while, even with the, we are building numbers, but again, because we are very carefully thinking about, actually thinking about each student as an individual. I mean, even if we think about free school meals, for example, we really think about, well, have they been on free school meals for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4, so actually, once you start passing the data like that, it becomes, lots of interesting questions.
Sorry,
Okay, yeah.
I'm just wondering whether things come up from the students that indicate changes required to the university, as opposed to more support for the student to navigate. Can you comment on that?
I don't know if I can comment on that. I think that there are a lot of things that I feel that we are learning as a programme ourselves, which I think will be, we are then trying to share as much as possible back out into the university, because I think we are learning, we're learning a lot. I think things around some of the sort of, again, I'm going to go back to teaching, learning and assumptions, even just things like that, to get those back out into the wider university would be really good. And I think that is what comes back from the students, just like, that's what we need more of.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, and Helen's actually put on what's perhaps quite a nice sort of final question as well, really, in terms of, for the three of you, where do you think the focus should next be in terms of taking this research forward? I know it's all funding dependent, many other things, but if we are looking at increasing the number of young people from these different care groups coming into HE, whether that's through a traditional route or through an FE route, what do you think are sort of next gaps in terms of what we need to know?
Shall I start? Yeah, thank you. This is such an interesting conversation. Thanks to everybody for contributing. I think next, what we probably clearly need to look at are the experiences of these people. So there needs to be more qualitative research, really unpacking how people navigate through higher education, or actually their post-16 education training journeys. So that I think is critical. I think we also need to look quantitatively at labour market outcomes. So longer term trajectories, I think that's really important. But just reflecting on this issue of culture shock, I think there's a lot going on there. I think that the point around culture shock is that actually there are very few people wear gowns and guinea fowl and that normal. But what we need to understand, I think, is I find the concept of plasticity really useful here. And it's the ability to cope with that shock varies enormously depending on people's brain space, apart from anything else. And so I think, a qualitative study that understands or goes in to try and understand the varied experiences of different people as they navigate through is really critical to take in this problem.
Leon,
What I emphasise the vocational pathways and understanding better what those are and what the experiences and the intentions were, the qualitative component of that. There must be huge variation within what that means.
Yeah.
Labour market outcomes has changed. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done.
Yeah, at the very start, really, of this. For you, Jo, is there anything that you think from the more practical kind of hands-on perspective?
I mean, so much. I mean, I think that, maybe slightly controversially, the note that I wrote down to myself is still around that. Actually, almost particularly for students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, I don't think they're even making the choices kind of before, I mean, they're not making choices before 60, but they are so quickly funneled into a particular route is the impression I get. Again, you know, going into some schools and talking to people and realising that actually, you know, I can't even go and have a conversation with some of those students because they've already been, so long ago they were put into, oh, well, you're going down that route. So yes, I mean, I think, again, thinking about how you can bring people from vocational routes into somewhere like Oxford if they wanted to, again, you know, it isn't going to be for everybody, but if they wanted to. So I think trying to work out how you facilitate that transition, which again is around the teaching and learning, I think, yes, and thinking about the skills that you require to be at university. So I think that, so that's two things. One is almost that really early education, how you stop them being funneled the wrong way, but then given people are, how you then say, well, okay, that was a decision you didn't make, you were just sent that route, so how can you now come back?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fantastic. I will bring us to a close because we're actually a minute over. So if I could just thank Leon, Jo and James for the discussion of your presentations today. It's been really, really interesting. And thank you to everyone who's joined us online for your questions and comments as well. It's lovely to have you join us, and we hope to see you again soon at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.